Still, the scrape of my old shoes on the bank's floor reminded me of the moment my own daughter laughed at them. As I steadied my grip on the pen, I kept my face calm, refusing to give her cruelty a place to land. While that soft scrape followed me, it sharpened every memory of how easily she dismissed me. As the sound settled into a slow rhythm, I realized it wasn't the shoes she mocked. It was the mother wearing them. That's when I understood the betrayal had been growing long before the joke. The same quiet scrape carried my verdict. A daughter who belittles her mother loses her access, not her mother's resolve. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen Carter stepped carefully up the worn steps of Dana's house, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. Her well-worn winter shoes, a patchwork of dark leather and scuffed soles, creaked as she shifted her weight. The shoes' age reflected in their faint smell of leather and dust. She had worn them for years. Years of trudging through Minneapolis's long, snowy winters, of running errands, of taking long walks with Emily. They had never failed her. But today, they felt heavier. Dana had invited her over for a coffee, as she often did these days. A request wrapped in the same sugar-coated tone she always used when asking for help. But something about it felt different today, though Helen couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way Dana had texted earlier, the words a little too sweet, the emojis too forced. When Helen entered, the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, but she couldn't escape the sharpness of Dana's eyes as they flicked downward to her shoes. "Mom, seriously?" Dana's voice was high-pitched, but not in the teasing way one might expect from a daughter. There was an edge to it, something sharp and condescending. Helen paused for a moment, her fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe, just for a second before she let go. "What's wrong, dear?" Dana smirked, crossing her arms over her chest, then laughed loudly. "Those shoes are embarrassing, Mom. You look like you stepped out of a thrift store." She glanced toward her friends, who had gathered around the kitchen table, cups of coffee in hand, the clink of mugs and soft chatter suddenly quieting as they looked over. "They're from the thrift store," Helen said, her voice calm, a gentle reminder that she'd always lived simply, frugally, even in the good years. But Dana wasn't done. She shook her head, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Mom still dresses like she's broke. It's pathetic." The laugh that followed was hollow, almost rehearsed, a subtle attempt to make Helen feel small. But in that moment, Helen didn't feel small at all. In fact, she felt a wave of quiet defiance, though it remained hidden behind the softness of her smile. As Dana's friends chuckled, Helen noticed Jason standing off to the side, his face buried in his phone. His usual silence wasn't surprising. He was the kind of man who avoided confrontation at all costs, even when it came to his own wife's cruelty. His eyes didn't lift from the screen, his fingers moving lazily over the device as if this whole scene didn't concern him. Emily, on the other hand, was sitting at the table, drawing quietly as she always did when her grandmother came over. But today, her eyes flicked between Dana and Helen, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and concern. Without a word, she quietly slipped from her chair and moved toward Helen's side, her small hand finding its place gently on her grandmother's arm. Helen looked down at Emily, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to slow. Emily's hand was warm, her touch unspoken but full of meaning. A silent promise that she saw her grandmother. She understood. Dana's voice broke through the quiet moment. "Well?" she pressed, waiting for Helen to respond. But Helen didn't say a word. She simply smiled and set the mug of tea in her hand down on the table, the porcelain clicking softly against the wood. "I'm fine, dear," Helen said, her voice smooth and unwavering. "I'm just fine." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken weight. but Dana didn't seem to hear them. She turned back to her friends, talking over Helen as if she hadn't even spoken. Helen could feel Emily's fingers tightening around her arm for a moment before she withdrew, returning to her seat at the table, her pencil still poised in her hand. Helen didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't snap back at Dana, though every part of her wanted to. But she had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of power. As Helen took a slow sip from her tea, the heat spreading through her chest, she realized something. She wasn't going to let Dana's cruel words, her thoughtless mockery, control her anymore. The decision had already been made. But Helen would take her time. She would move carefully, step by step, as she had always done. And so, as Dana's laughter continued to ripple through the room, Helen leaned back in her chair, taking another sip of her tea, and let the silence settle around her like the first snow of winter. The kind that covered everything in a quiet, unbroken layer. The kind that couldn't be ignored. It was time. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the dim light of the winter afternoon filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and the last remnants of her tea, but it felt colder somehow, like the house had absorbed the chill from the world outside. The bank statements, stacked neatly in front of her, were a stark contrast to the soft, comforting hum of the house. Each one, a quiet but undeniable reminder of what she had ignored for so long. She picked up the first statement, her fingers brushing the paper's crisp edges as though the very action of touching it would reveal something more than the numbers printed on the page. Helen had never been one for scrutinizing the details, always content to glance over the accounts, trusting everything was in order. She had always believed Dana would manage her share responsibly, as they'd discussed years ago, but today, that trust felt naive. Helen leaned forward, the creaking of her old chair barely audible over the steady beat of the clock on the wall. She read through the first statement again, slower this time, her eyes narrowing at each line of transactions. There it was. A withdrawal of $500 at a luxury department store, then another $200 for a grocery run that seemed highly inflated, and a third, this time $400 at a spa. It wasn't the amount that caught her off guard, it was the frequency. One after another, Dana's withdrawals piled up, each one an echo of the life she was living, a life of excess that Helen had quietly funded. Helen's hand trembled ever so slightly as she reached for a red pen. She circled every transaction, each one a blow to the quiet rhythm of her trust, her patience. 1,000 tiny cuts, invisible to the eye but undeniable now, laid bare in the cold light of afternoon. As she moved through the rest of the statements, the numbers became more suffocating, more relentless. There were dozens of transactions, many for things Helen knew Dana didn't need. It wasn't just that Dana was spending her money, it was that she was doing it carelessly, as though it would always be there, waiting for her. The sharp, familiar sound of the doorbell interrupted Helen's thoughts. She didn't need to check the clock. She knew it was Margaret. Her best friend had a way of showing up right when Helen needed her most. Helen walked slowly to the door, still clutching the bank statements, her face unreadable. Margaret's bright, eager expression faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw the papers in Helen's hand, and she stepped inside without a word. "Sit down, Margaret," Helen said quietly, gesturing to the kitchen table. Margaret, ever perceptive, didn't ask any questions, but her eyes followed Helen's every movement, reading the tension in the older woman's posture. Helen sat back down at the table, flipping open the next statement, the silence between them thick. Margaret's sharp eyes darted over the figures on the page, taking in the withdrawals, the spa visits, the designer purchases. She didn't need to ask what was going on. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line as she picked up the pen Helen had left beside the papers. "Helen," she began, her voice low, almost hesitant. "She's draining you." Helen didn't respond at first. She didn't need to. The words hung between them, too raw, too painful to argue with. She had known it for some time, deep down, but hearing it aloud felt different. The truth always did. "I thought—" Helen's voice cracked for the briefest moment before she cleared her throat. "I thought I was helping her, Margaret. I thought, if I gave her a little support, she'd get on her feet. She was struggling after your husband passed." Margaret nodded, but her gaze didn't soften. "I know, Helen. You wanted to help. But this isn't helping. She's taking more than you can afford to give." Helen's fingers tightened around the papers. The weight of the last few years settled heavily on her chest. She had been so patient, so willing to forgive. But now, looking at these numbers, the truth was undeniable. Before Helen could respond, her phone buzzed on the table, its suddenness pulling her from the quiet storm of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Dana's name. Helen didn't hesitate to open the message. It read, "Mom, send me $200 for the spa tomorrow. It's for a pampering day. Need it for my stress, you know?" The irony of the message, the entitlement laced in those words, hit Helen like a slap. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Dana's expectation, so casual, so demanding, was a slap in the face. Helen's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, to still the rising anger that threatened to surface. Margaret watched her closely, sensing the shift in the air. She didn't say anything, but her expression softened in quiet understanding. Helen put the phone down, her hands cold against the worn wood of the table. She didn't respond to the text. Not yet. But the decision was made now, clearer than ever. The weight of the past few years settled in her bones, but something else began to rise. A quiet strength. This had gone on for far too long. Dana would no longer have free access to her life, her money, or her generosity. And tomorrow, it would all change. Helen stood at the curb, staring up at the gray, imposing facade of the bank. The tall glass windows reflecting the cloudy Minneapolis sky seemed as cold and distant as the decision she had made. Beside her, Margaret fidgeted, her hands buried in the pockets of her coat, but Helen didn't need to see her to know that Margaret was nervous too. For years, Helen had relied on trust, and trust had led her here, into this moment where that very trust was being tested, pulled apart thread by thread. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret's voice was quiet, hesitant, as though the question had been hanging on her tongue for a while. Helen took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs. It was cold, but it felt sharp, like a reset. "I've never been more sure." The door to the bank opened with a soft chime as they stepped inside. The warmth enveloped them instantly, the low murmur of voices and the clicking of keyboards against the sterile, polished floor creating an odd sense of normalcy. But Helen's heart beat faster with each step they took toward the bank manager's office. Charles Benton, the manager, stood up from behind his desk as they entered. A man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair and a crisp suit that spoke of professionalism. His eyes softened when he saw Helen, his face familiar yet distant, as if he'd known her long enough to recognize the weight of her presence. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with curiosity. "Good to see you again. What can I do for you today?" Helen didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the screenshots she'd taken of the last few months' bank statements, each one more damning than the last. Without a word, she handed the phone to Charles, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the device, the screen reflecting her resolve. Charles took the phone, his eyebrows raising slightly as he scrolled through the withdrawals. He didn't look at Helen. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen, but his expression told a story. It was a mixture of concern and disbelief. "These are frequent," he said slowly, his voice neutral but weighted. "And the amounts. What do you think, Mrs. Carter?" Helen's lips pressed together. She was calm, but inside there was a strange kind of quiet fury building, bubbling beneath the surface. She hadn't come here for answers. Not really. She had come here for action, for a plan. And that's what she was going to get. "I didn't realize it at first," she said, her voice steady, but each word felt like it carried the weight of years. "I trusted her. I thought, I thought I was helping her. She lost her father, and I didn't want her to struggle. I thought if I gave her access to the joint account, she'd get back on her feet. But it's gone on too long. She's draining me, Charles. And I can't keep letting it happen." Charles nodded, but his expression was serious. He handed the phone back to Helen, then leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "This is a common situation with families," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, but with an underlying sympathy. "Elder financial abuse, even from loved ones, happens more than you might think." Helen stiffened at the words, but didn't flinch. She had heard whispers about such things, but it hadn't truly hit her until now. Until Dana. "Mrs. Carter, you've done the right thing by coming to us. There are options," Charles continued, his tone shifting into a more businesslike cadence. "There are financial protections for elderly clients, including freezing accounts, setting spending alerts, and, if necessary, putting a block on any further withdrawals. We can also help you establish a separate account that's fully protected." Helen felt a wave of relief at the mention of protection, but it didn't quite quell the anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior. Still, she nodded, taking in his words. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Charles glanced at Margaret for a moment, then back at Helen. "We'll need to start by revoking Dana's access to the joint account. I'll issue new cards and set up the alerts you've requested. From there, we can monitor the account closely, ensuring no further unauthorized withdrawals." Helen's pulse quickened. She had known this was the next step, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it feel real, irrevocable. The door she was walking through now couldn't be closed again. "Do it," Helen said, her voice sharper than she intended. But there was no room for hesitation now. Charles nodded, already moving to pull up the necessary paperwork on his computer. "I'll prepare everything for you to sign. Once the new accounts are set up, we can take the next steps." Helen felt Margaret's gaze on her but didn't turn to meet it. There was no room for softness now. No room for second-guessing. Her hands were steady as she signed the forms, and with each stroke of the pen, she felt a quiet finality settle over her. This was no longer about helping Dana. This was about protecting herself. As she handed the forms back to Charles, he met her eyes once more. "We'll have everything processed within a few hours," he assured her, his voice reassuring but still tinged with professionalism. Helen didn't reply immediately. She just stood, her mind already racing ahead, already imagining the moment Dana would realize what had happened. But then, just before she left, Charles spoke again. His voice dropped slightly and his eyes softened. "Mrs. Carter, I know this is difficult, but I'm glad you're taking control now. You've made the right choice." Helen nodded, the words hanging in the air, both comforting and heavy at once. She hadn't been sure until this moment, but now, standing in this quiet office, she was certain. The plan had been set. The final step was near, and Dana wouldn't know what hit her. The room felt different now, as though a quiet but powerful shift had just occurred. The documents Charles Benton had placed before her were crisp and official-looking, and with each one, Helen felt herself moving further away from the version of her life she had known into something new, something irrevocable. She sat at the polished wooden desk, her hands flat on the surface, the papers before her a clear line in the sand. The bank's logo was stamped across the top of each page, the letters sharp, almost cold in their precision. Charles stood beside her, waiting. His expression was calm, but there was a knowing in his eyes, a recognition that something heavy was unfolding here. Margaret, sitting across from her, seemed almost too quiet, the weight of what was happening settling over her too. The pen felt heavier than usual in Helen's hand, though her fingers were steady. She signed the first form, her signature flowing with practiced ease. Each letter felt final, like a door shutting behind her. No going back. She signed again. And again. Dana's name had once appeared as a co-signer, an equal player in this quiet partnership. But with each stroke of her pen, Helen erased that, revoked it. Dana was no longer the one Helen had trusted. She would no longer have the right to anything tied to these accounts. No access to the funds, no claim to what Helen had built over a lifetime. Helen didn't look at Charles as she signed the last of the documents. She didn't need to. His presence, quiet and professional, was a balm. He was facilitating this change, but it was Helen herself who had decided it. She set the pen down with a quiet click, the finality of the action rippling through her. The room felt smaller now, as though the act of cutting Dana out had shrunk the space between them, making everything seem more confined, more intimate. Charles moved swiftly, pulling up a new set of debit cards, one in Helen's name and one for an account that would no longer carry the same vulnerabilities as before. The cards, fresh and gleaming, were now the physical embodiment of the new boundaries Helen had just drawn. "This is just the beginning," Charles said, as he handed the cards to Helen. His voice was almost a whisper now, a quiet acknowledgement of what he knew this meant. "We'll get the alerts set up for you. You'll be able to monitor everything, every withdrawal, every transaction." Helen nodded, slipping the cards into her purse, feeling the weight of them against the fabric. They were more than just pieces of plastic. They were her armor now, protection, control. Margaret rose to her feet, pulling her own phone from her pocket. "I'll help you reorganize your savings. I'll get everything set into protected accounts so that there's no more risk," she said, her voice still soft, but carrying a determination Helen hadn't heard before. Margaret had always been the practical one, the one who looked at the numbers and saw only the logic. But today, there was something else, something fierce in her eyes. Helen nodded, appreciative of her friend's unwavering support. Margaret had been there, standing beside her through years of doubt, of questions she never asked, of decisions she had made out of kindness, not caution. Now, Margaret's practical wisdom was her anchor. She needed it now more than ever. "I'll get everything set up," Margaret said, her fingers already flying over the screen of her phone as she spoke. Helen watched her, but her mind was elsewhere, her gaze fixed on the door in front of her. "Can we also set up alerts?" Helen asked, her voice breaking through the quiet buzz of activity. She hadn't thought to ask earlier, but now that the accounts were being fortified, it felt like the right time. She wanted to know, to see, every transaction, no matter how small. Charles turned from his desk, a quick but reassuring smile crossing his face. "Of course, I'll have that set up for you right now. You'll be notified immediately if anything changes, if anything out of the ordinary occurs." Helen didn't respond, but something in her chest lightened. The chaos of the past weeks, the quiet, hidden betrayals, was beginning to settle. She had done it. She had taken control. Before the tension could fully dissipate, Helen's phone buzzed sharply in her purse. It was an incoming message. She didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. "Mom, what's going on? I'm at the mall, and my card is being declined. Are you messing with my account again? I need it unlocked right now." The words were familiar, but today, They didn't have the same sting. They were a simple reflection of Dana's entitlement, of her assumption that everything, every dollar, every decision, belonged to her. Helen's grip tightened around the phone as she read the message. But instead of the familiar twinge of guilt or the rush to explain, all she felt was quiet resolve. She set the phone back down on the desk without responding immediately, her gaze lingering on the words Dana had sent her. Then, she turned to Charles. "I'll look into it later," she said, her voice calm but firm. Her fingers brushed the surface of the table as she pushed back her chair and stood up. It was time to go. Margaret paused for a moment, looking at Helen. "You sure about that?" she asked gently. Helen met her eyes, her gaze unflinching. "It's time for her to figure it out on her own." And with that, Helen turned and walked out of the office, the new debit cards tucked safely in her purse. The cold winter air greeted her as the door swung open. But this time, it didn't feel biting. It felt like the first breath of a life redefined, where every decision, every step, was hers alone to make. As they exited the bank, Margaret at her side, Helen felt the weight of the past few years lift, just a little. The cards in her purse, the plans in motion, were just the beginning. The real shift was yet to come. And Dana, for the first time, wouldn't be ready for it. The sky had turned a dull slate gray by the time Helen and Margaret stepped back inside the bank the following morning. A light flurry drifted past the glass walls, the kind of lazy winter snow that didn't quite commit to falling. Helen's breath came out in a slow mist as she walked, the cold sinking deeper than she expected. Not from the temperature, but from the weight of everything she had already uncovered. Charles met them at the entrance, his expression unusually tense, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the folder he carried. Helen noticed it immediately. Something was wrong in a way she hadn't yet imagined. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice lower than yesterday, "there's something else we need to discuss." Helen exchanged a glance with Margaret, whose brows knit together in instant suspicion. They followed Charles into his office, the door clicking shut behind them with a soft but unmistakable finality. Charles didn't sit. That alone made Helen's stomach tighten. He set the folder on the desk, opened it slowly, and pulled out a series of printed pages, credit reports, balances, unfamiliar account details. He slid them toward Helen with a kind of careful hesitation, as though the papers themselves were dangerous. "Helen," he said gently, "a new credit line was opened last month. In your name." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Helen's hand hovered above the papers but didn't touch them. She stared at the print, the numbers, the date. Her pulse thudded in her ears, the sound loud enough to drown out everything else. Charles continued quietly. "We cross-checked the application. The address listed is Dana's home. And the signature." He hesitated. "It doesn't look like yours." Silence. Pure, heavy silence. Helen felt her jaw tighten, a physical snap of muscle beneath her skin. But she didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. The betrayal struck deep, but it hit a place inside her that had gone still last night, after Dana's panicked text. A place that understood, finally, painfully, just how far her daughter was willing to go. Margaret reacted first. She reached out, her voice a mix of outrage and fear. "Helen, you need to freeze your credit. Immediately. This is identity fraud. She's stealing from you in ways you haven't even seen yet." Helen inhaled slowly, feeling the sting of cold air reach the back of her throat. "I see," she murmured, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. Margaret squeezed her arm. "We're not letting this go. Not now." Charles nodded, pulling another set of documents from the folder. "We can start the process here. You'll need to file alerts with the 3 major credit bureaus. They'll notify you of any attempts to open accounts, and block everything unless you approve it." Helen took the papers this time. Her fingers trembled only slightly. "Show me where to sign." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of formal language, printed confirmations, and long-distance calls. Helen repeated her social security number more times than she cared to count. She placed fraud alerts with Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. She requested full account histories, not just for herself, but for anything linked to her name. Every form felt like both a shield and a wound, armor forged from betrayal. Margaret sat close, her presence solid and grounding. Every so often, Helen felt her friend watching her, likely waiting for her to break. But she didn't. Not once. Because something inside Helen had hardened, not in anger, but resolve. Dana had crossed a line, a deep one, and now Helen could finally see the full shape of the damage she'd spent years ignoring. When everything was finally set, Charles closed the folder with a soft thud. "You've done the right thing," he said gently. "This stops now." Helen nodded, exhaling slowly. Her life had changed yesterday. But today, the ground itself had shifted. As she gathered her purse, her phone vibrated in the side pocket. She didn't check it immediately. She needed a moment before letting Dana's chaos flood back in. But Margaret nudged her gently. "Could be Emily," she said. Helen pulled the phone out. It was Emily. And the short voicemail, only 6 seconds, made Helen's stomach drop. "Grandma, Mom's really mad about money today. Like, really mad. Just wanted you to know." The message ended abruptly, the background noise of raised voices lingering in the silence that followed. Margaret looked at Helen sharply. "She's escalating." Helen swallowed, the cold returning to the pit of her stomach. She tightened her grip on the phone, the weight of everything settling deeper, heavier. If Dana was already this angry, and she had no idea yet about the credit freeze, the revoked access, the new accounts, then the storm hadn't hit. Not even close. Helen slipped the phone back into her purse, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's time," she whispered, almost to herself. But the question lingered in the air. Time for what? The air inside the estate attorney's office smelled faintly of wood polish and aged leather, the kind of scent that belonged to old, trusted things. Helen's gaze lingered on the oak-paneled walls, the thick carpet beneath her feet, the certificates of practice hanging on the walls, all symbols of permanence. But today, the words on the papers she'd brought with her would forever change the shape of her legacy. Helen felt a tightness in her chest as she sat at the long conference table. Margaret had accompanied her, as she had for every crucial step in this journey, her calm presence, like a steadying anchor. It wasn't that Helen needed guidance anymore. It was just that Margaret's quiet strength had become a lifeline in the aftermath of her daughter's betrayal. The estate attorney, a man named David Collins, adjusted his glasses and flipped through the folder Helen had handed him. He was in his late 50s, his hands professional but kind as they ran over the papers. He glanced at Helen, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken understanding. "I've reviewed the documents you requested, Mrs. Carter. It's clear you've made some significant changes in your affairs." Helen nodded. "It's time." David gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own, his eyes briefly flicking toward Margaret, who sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Then he set aside the papers, preparing a fresh draft of the will. Helen's fingers gripped the armrests of her chair, the weight of what was coming sinking into her bones. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, dignity, and drawing a line that no one would ever cross again. Margaret looked up from her phone, where she had been quietly taking notes, her gaze shifting from Helen to David. "The most important thing, I think, is making sure Emily is secure," Margaret said softly, her words deliberate and kind. "She's the one who sees Helen clearly. She deserves to be protected." Helen's heart squeezed at the mention of Emily. She had always known, deep down, that the time would come when the love and care she'd poured into her daughter would be tested. But she hadn't expected this. This betrayal that now, more than ever, made Emily her only true heir. David looked between them both, his eyes compassionate yet professional. "I'll make sure Emily is named as the primary beneficiary. If you're ready, we can proceed with the changes." Helen didn't hesitate. "Yes, it's time to remove Dana." David didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The weight of what had led them here was clear, and the forms that would soon be signed would make that official. As he typed, Helen's mind wandered briefly to the past. She remembered a time when Dana had been a bright, eager child, when they'd laughed together, when Dana had still held her hand in the grocery store, asking questions about the world. But that was long gone now. The daughter she had raised, the one she had sacrificed for, was now someone else. A person Helen didn't recognize. The attorney finished typing and slid the document in front of her. Helen's gaze fixed on the words. "I, Helen Carter, hereby remove my daughter, Dana Carter, from all claims to my estate, including assets and financial accounts." Her pen hovered over the lines, her fingers barely shaking. The decision had been made long ago, but seeing it in black and white, her name in bold, was still a weight, a finality. She signed it. David then handed her a second page. "This outlines the assets and distribution," he said. "As you wish, Emily will receive everything, with the exception of a few small items you may want to retain." Helen signed again, the pen moving smoothly but with deliberate care. With each stroke, she felt the years of tension, of unspoken grievances slowly lifting, but the weight of the past still pressed on her shoulders. Margaret placed a comforting hand on her arm, giving her a quiet moment of solace before Helen signed the final line. When it was done, the changes were official. David set down the pen, folding the document with practiced precision. "The will is now legally binding. You'll receive a copy shortly, and if you ever need to make further adjustments, you can always reach out." Helen stood up, feeling a strange lightness in her chest. The burden that had weighed so heavily on her shoulders for so long, the need to protect Dana, the need to support her, even when she didn't deserve it, had lifted. She had done the right thing. For Emily. For herself. Before they left the office, Margaret spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "Helen, I think it's time we protect the rest of your assets too. The joint accounts, your savings. We can move everything over and make sure there's nothing left for Dana to access." Helen turned to her friend, her resolve settling deeper. Yes, it's time to close the door on her, for good. Just as they were about to leave, Helen's phone buzzed once again, the screen lighting up with an incoming message. She didn't have to check it. She knew who it was. It was Dana. She held up her phone for a moment, her eyes flicking over the message that blinked on the screen. "Mom, I need $500 for an emergency. You know how bad things are. Please, I need it right now." Helen's stomach twisted at the familiar demand. She had long since learned that these emergencies were nothing more than Dana's insatiable need for more, for something she hadn't earned, and probably never would. Without a word, Helen pressed the button to close the message and slipped the phone back into her purse. "I'm busy," she said quietly, her voice firm, but without a trace of emotion. And with that, they walked out of the office, leaving the past, and Dana, behind. The sound of the pen's smooth motion across the paper was the only noise in the room. It was methodical, rhythmic, and in its quiet finality, it felt like the softest surrender. Helen's hand, steady and sure, signed the final page of her updated will and trust. The pen moved fluidly from one line to the next, each letter carrying with it the weight of years spent in quiet patience and hidden sacrifice. Emily had always been her heart's true heir, the one who had shown kindness when it wasn't expected, the one who had quietly understood when no one else did. Now, legally, she was the only one. The daughter who had mocked, who had drained and manipulated, was no longer a part of this story. Helen had made sure of that. Margaret sat beside her, watching quietly, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet pride. There were no words exchanged between them, none were necessary. They had been through enough together that no acknowledgement was required. The decision had been made, and it was now set in stone. Emily, not Dana, would inherit everything. And with that simple stroke of the pen, the burden was lifted. Helen pushed the papers toward David Collins, who had been patiently waiting, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but with a quiet strength she hadn't felt in years. She signed the final page, and just like that, Dana's name was gone from the documents. In its place, Emily's name stood bold and unshakable. David glanced over the forms, ensuring everything was in order. "All done. You'll receive a copy in the mail, but if you ever need to make changes, you know where to find me." Helen stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the past fall away, piece by piece. It wasn't just the inheritance, it was the years of guilt, of emotional manipulation, of being there when Dana didn't deserve it. It was the end of all the quiet sacrifices, the quiet forgiveness. But there was still one last thing to do. As Helen and Margaret made their way out of the office, her phone buzzed, pulling her back into the harsh reality she'd been trying to escape. She didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Dana. Helen's thumb hovered over the message, but she didn't open it. She knew the kind of text it would be. Angry, accusing, manipulative. It always was. She slid the phone into her bag without responding. There was no point anymore. As they stepped outside into the sharp cold of the Minneapolis afternoon, Margaret glanced at Helen. "You're sure about all this?" Helen turned to her, her expression firm. "Yes. Emily is my future, not Dana. I've done enough for her. It's time to focus on what really matters." Margaret smiled, a quiet approval in her eyes. "You've done the right thing, Helen. The weight you've been carrying, it's gone now." Helen didn't answer right away. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to Dana and Jason, to the people she had loved so deeply, but had only ever taken from her. She could feel the shift inside her, something inside her that had cracked wide open. The years of unspoken resentment and hurt had finally been addressed. Dana wasn't the only one who had been changed through this. Helen looked at Margaret, her heart steady, unburdened. "I'm never going back." They both walked to the car, the cold air biting at their faces. But it was different now. The weight of the past, the years of looking over her shoulder, the nagging sense of guilt. It was all behind her now. That evening, as Helen settled into the worn armchair by the window, the soft glow of the streetlight filtering through the frosted panes, she checked her phone. The message was still there. She had known it would be. The text from Dana read, "Mom, I need $500 for an emergency. I'm not asking for much. I just need some help. Why are you doing this to me?" Helen stared at the message for a long time, the words ringing in her ears. They weren't new. They were the same words Dana had always used, the same desperate tone that had never quite convinced Helen to give in. Helen's finger hovered over the screen, ready to delete the message. And as she did, another message popped up. This one from Jason. "Are you okay?" Helen paused. Jason's simple question, stripped of all the drama and manipulation, hit harder than she expected. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of what had happened. It was simply concern, a question that had been buried under years of neglect. Helen took a long breath, her thumb moving slowly over the phone as she typed the single, quiet reply. "Never better." And as she hit send, Helen felt the last of the weight lift from her shoulders, the final chapter closing. Dana's text message, her demands, her anger, were all a reflection of the past. The future, however, was still unwritten. And for the first time in a long time, Helen was ready to write it herself. The door slammed open with such force that it rattled the frames on the wall, the sound of it echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. Dana stormed in, her face flushed with fury, eyes wild with accusation. She didn't even pause, didn't knock, didn't give Helen a chance to react. "Mom!" she spat, voice laced with venom, her hands clenched at her sides. "What the hell have you done?" Helen didn't flinch. She didn't rise to meet Dana's anger, didn't move an inch. She simply sat in her favorite armchair, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze calm but unwavering. She had seen this storm coming. Dana stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step like a drumbeat. "You've completely ruined my life. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've taken everything. You sabotaged me." Helen didn't react immediately. She simply let the words wash over her, her posture relaxed, her expression steady. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the reckoning she knew was inevitable. "You think I wanted this?" Dana shouted, her face twisted in disbelief. "How could you do this to your own daughter? You've destroyed everything I've built, everything I've worked for." Helen didn't raise her voice, didn't let the anger in Dana's tone provoke a response. Instead, she continued to sit in silence, letting the moment stretch out, forcing Dana to realize that her screams were falling on deaf ears. Dana paced in front of her, her words becoming increasingly frantic, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "I trusted you. I trusted you, and you—" She broke off, her voice cracking with the weight of her fury, but still, Helen remained silent. Finally, Dana stopped in front of her, hands on her hips, chest heaving. "Unfreeze the money, Mom. Now." Helen's eyes flicked to the phone on the coffee table where the alerts for her account had been buzzing non-stop all morning, but she made no move to check them. "It was never yours?" Helen said, her voice low but clear. Her words weren't cold, but they held a firmness, an undeniable finality. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to be swayed. She had made her choice. Dana's mouth opened, as if to argue, but she quickly snapped it shut. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that Helen had once believed could only be love, but now it was something darker, something unrecognizable. She stepped closer, her voice dropping, dangerously soft. "You think this is all about money?" Dana hissed. "You think taking my access to your accounts is going to make me go away? I'm your daughter, Mom. You can't just cut me out like this. You can't." Helen met Dana's gaze, holding it steady. "I can." And I did. A tense silence stretched between them, the weight of Helen's words hanging in the air. Dana's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, as if the realization of what had just happened was still sinking in. The quiet in the room felt heavier than the storm that had just passed through. As if on cue, Helen's phone buzzed again. It was an incoming call. Without a word, she picked it up, glanced at the screen, and then calmly answered. "Hello?" It was Sharon. "Helen, what the hell is going on?" Sharon's voice came through the line, sharp and demanding. "Dana's been calling me nonstop, and now she's at your house? You can't just freeze her out like this. This isn't how family works." "You're making a huge mistake." Helen's fingers tightened around the phone, but she didn't look away from Dana. The anger was still there, but the uncertainty was gone. She had made her choice. "I'm sorry, Sharon," Helen said quietly, her voice calm but resolute. "But I'm not going to explain myself to you or to Dana. I've made my decision, and it stands." Sharon's voice grew louder, more frantic. "Helen, you can't just cut your daughter out like this. She's your daughter." Helen didn't flinch. She was, but not anymore. Before Sharon could respond, Helen ended the call. She looked at the phone in her hand for a moment before setting it back down on the coffee table. Dana was still standing there, glaring at her, but there was no more fight left in her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Helen to be so calm, so unyielding. Helen sat back in her chair, eyes never leaving her daughter's face. "You'll figure it out, Dana. You've always figured it out, even if I wasn't there to bail you out every time." The words were softer now, almost a sad truth, more than an accusation. Dana opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her expression caught between fury and disbelief. And then, as if it couldn't happen any other way, Emily appeared in the doorway. Her small frame was visible in the shadow of the hallway, her eyes wide but proud. She had been watching, waiting. She didn't say a word, but when she met her grandmother's gaze, it was clear. She understood, and she was proud. Dana saw Emily standing there, and for the first time, something in her expression faltered. She didn't have the words anymore, didn't have the anger, the manipulation, the excuses. All that was left was the silence between them. Without another word, Dana turned and stormed out of the house, the door slamming behind her. The weight of her departure hung in the air for only a moment before it was gone, as though it had never been there at all. Helen looked over at Emily, her granddaughter standing at the threshold, her eyes unblinking. "It's over," Helen said softly. Emily smiled, her small face lighting up with an expression of quiet pride. "It is, Grandma. It really is." Helen smiled back, feeling the first true weightlessness she had felt in years. The storm had passed, and the calm was more peaceful than she could have imagined. Helen was in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space, when the phone rang. It was early, and the house still carried the quiet weight of the morning after. Yesterday had felt like a turning point, the kind of quiet finality that follows a storm's passage. Dana had left. The door had slammed, but it wasn't the sound of a relationship ending. It was the echo of a final decision. Helen had stood firm, even as Dana's fury had burned hot and fast. There was no going back. But the phone ringing, especially this early, meant something different. It wasn't a call she'd been expecting. She glanced at the screen, seeing Charles Benton's name appear, and felt a strange twist in her stomach. She'd thought everything was settled. The fraud alerts had been set, the documents signed, the future finally in her hands. She picked up the phone. "Hello, Charles," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but something in her chest tightened. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter." Charles's voice came through, crisp but gentle. "I hate to be the bearer of more bad news, but we've had another development." Helen's heart stuttered in her chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the tension she felt building. "I've just received a notification," he said, his tone even but laced with concern. "Dana tried to open a credit account again, using your details." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Again. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the sudden rush of anger and disbelief that surged through her veins. She had thought Dana had learned her lesson, but she had clearly been wrong. "She's still trying to use my name?" Helen whispered. The question wasn't for Charles. It was more for herself. How had it come to this? How had her daughter, the woman she had raised and sacrificed for, become someone she could no longer recognize? Charles continued, his voice softening slightly. "The application triggered a fraud alert with the credit agencies. Thankfully, your alerts caught it, and it was blocked before anything could go through. But we're going to need to address this formally. I'll have to file a report with the fraud department." Helen stood silently, staring out of the window at the empty street. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world still and frozen. How fitting, she thought. Everything had come to a halt, a clean, frozen moment in time. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice tight. "How is it even possible that she's doing this? After everything? After all the steps I've taken to protect myself?" Charles's response was measured but firm. "It seems she hasn't taken the full scope of the consequences seriously. Unfortunately, this may not be over yet. Dana could face legal consequences if this continues. And we can't ignore the pattern here. This is more than just financial misuse. This is identity theft." Helen's mind raced as she processed what he was saying. Legal consequences. The weight of those words sank in. For years, Helen had been trying to protect her daughter, but what if this wasn't just a betrayal anymore? What if Dana was crossing a line that had no return? "I'll make sure all necessary steps are taken," Charles added. "But you'll need to make sure the documentation is updated too, to reflect the gravity of the situation." Helen nodded, though Charles couldn't see it. "Thank you. I'll handle it." As the conversation ended, she set the phone down slowly, her mind still churning. There was more to this now. This wasn't just about cutting off access. It was about making sure Dana couldn't hurt her anymore. It was about making sure that she was the one who controlled the narrative, the one who had the power, not Dana. Helen walked into the living room where Margaret had been sitting, flipping through a book. She looked up as Helen entered, noting the change in her expression. "What's happened?" Margaret asked, her voice soft, always attuned to the shifts in Helen's mood. "It's not over," Helen said quietly, her words heavy. "Dana tried again, to open a credit account, using my name." Margaret's eyes widened and she put the book down. "She's still doing this? After everything?" Helen nodded, her face set in grim determination. "She hasn't learned anything, and now it could get worse." Charles said she could face legal consequences if this keeps happening. Margaret's frown deepened. "She's running out of options. I'm glad the fraud alerts worked, but this could escalate. And you need to protect yourself, Helen. You've already made the decision to keep her out of your life. Don't let this go any further. There's no telling what she'll do next." Helen thought for a moment, her gaze turning inward as she recalled the signature on her updated will. Emily. It was always meant to be Emily. Dana's name had already been erased, but now, more than ever, Helen knew she had to act decisively. She had to close every door. "I'll have to make some additional changes," she said, her voice quiet, but her decision firm. "I can't leave anything open. Not anymore. I'll make sure everything is locked down completely." Margaret nodded, reaching over to help Helen with the papers. "We'll do it together. We'll make sure she's out of your life, once and for all." Helen's gaze shifted to the hallway, where Emily had appeared, standing silently by the door, watching the conversation unfold. Helen's heart softened when she saw her granddaughter. Emily didn't speak, but there was an understanding in her eyes. She was learning, growing, and she understood more than anyone else could. "Grandma?" Emily said softly. "I don't want Mom to hurt you anymore." Helen's heart ached. She gave Emily a small, tender smile. "I know, sweetheart." And she won't. As Helen sat down at the desk to update her final documents, the quiet weight of the decision settled over her once again. This was the end. For Dana. For everything. And this time, there would be no turning back. The final stroke of the pen felt like a promise. Never again. The letter arrived quietly, slipped into the mailbox, waiting like a final piece in the puzzle. Helen didn't need to open it to know what was inside. She had already signed the documents, already made the calls, already set her life on a new course. But even so, the envelope, white and crisp with the bank's logo printed across the top, made her heart stutter. This wasn't just business anymore. This was the end of an era, the confirmation of what she had already chosen. She held the letter in her hands for a moment, tracing the sharp edges of the envelope with her fingers. It felt like the calm before a storm that she had already weathered, but somehow, holding it, she could feel the shift in her chest, the last of the old world slipping away. With a deep breath, Helen opened the letter. The words inside were simple, direct, and cold. Dana was officially barred from all access to Helen's accounts. The joint accounts, the credit lines, every avenue Dana had once used to bleed her mother dry were now closed off completely. The letter confirmed it all. There were no more second chances, no more access, no more support. Helen set the letter down slowly, the finality of it settling in. She didn't feel relief. Not exactly. It wasn't a happy moment. It wasn't a victorious one. But it was peace, in its own quiet way. Peace from the constant worry, from the guilt that had clung to her for years, from the silent weight of every dollar Dana had drained. It was a simple, undeniable truth. She was free. And then the phone rang. Helen didn't need to look at the screen. She knew who it was. Dana's name had appeared before, every time the drama and desperation swelled, and now it appeared again. She almost didn't answer. She wanted to leave it, to ignore it, to keep the walls between them high and unyielding, but something inside her, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the remnants of care that never fully disappeared, compelled her to press the button. Hello? Helen's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. A sob broke through the line. Mom, Mom, please. Dana's voice was raw, breaking with emotion, a stark contrast to the anger that had once been her armor. I don't understand. You're really cutting me off? Please. I didn't mean to. I didn't think. Helen let the words fall away, let the sobs wash over her without interruption. She didn't rush to explain, didn't offer the answers Dana wanted to hear. There was no more explaining to do, no more rescue. Helen had said everything that needed to be said when she made her decision. I can't keep doing this, Dana, Helen finally said, her voice calm, even a little distant. This isn't a mistake. You've crossed a line, and now we both have to deal with it. Dana tried to speak again, but Helen didn't listen. She didn't need to. It wasn't about Dana's confusion or her tears anymore. It was about something bigger, something Helen had spent too long ignoring. After a long pause, Helen added, It's done. There was no reply. The line went quiet, and for a moment, Helen wondered if Dana had even stayed on the phone. But she didn't check. She didn't need to. As the conversation ended, Margaret entered the room, holding a cup of tea for Helen, her expression soft with understanding. She placed the cup in front of her, giving her a moment of comfort without needing to ask. I'm sorry you had to take that call, Margaret said quietly, sitting down beside her. Helen just nodded, the weight of it all hanging between them. It doesn't matter anymore. Margaret smiled faintly. No, it doesn't. Helen sat back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. The world outside seemed to mirror the stillness inside her. Calm, but with a lingering sense of something lost, something irrevocable. The next few hours were spent organizing, not just documents, but emotions. Margaret helped her put together a binder titled Protected Assets. It wasn't just a practical step, it was a mental one too. A way of locking away everything that Dana could no longer touch. They meticulously went through every page, every account, every asset, ensuring that everything was accounted for, everything was safeguarded. Helen felt a quiet satisfaction as they finished. The binder sat there, sturdy and organized, a visual reminder that she was in control now, that Dana's grip had been severed. When the task was done, Helen stood up and walked to the hall closet. She had been meaning to do this for a long time, but today, it felt right. The old shoes, worn, battered, full of memories, had served her faithfully for years. But they were gone now, a symbol of everything she had left behind. She took them from the shelf, looked at them one last time, and then dropped them into the donation bag. As she turned to leave, she felt a small hand tugging at her sleeve. Emily stood there, holding something small but important in her hands. "I bought you something," Emily said, her voice soft, yet filled with a sense of quiet pride. She opened the small box in her hands to reveal a new pair of shoes, shiny, polished, and carefully chosen with the money Emily had earned from babysitting. They weren't fancy, they weren't expensive, but they were new, and they were from her. Helen smiled at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with a love that felt both old and fresh, a reminder that not everything was lost. She slipped her feet into the new shoes, the sensation warm and grounding, a feeling of beginning anew. "Thank you, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "These are perfect." Emily smiled, her eyes bright. "I'm glad, Grandma. You deserve them." And in that moment, Helen knew that whatever came next, she was ready. The past was behind her, the future was wide open, and she was finally, truly free. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:45 p.m., just as Helen had predicted. The time was chosen deliberately, each tick of the clock serving as a silent countdown to this moment. She had known it would come. She had known they would try to fix things, to manipulate their way back into her life. Dana and Jason, standing at the threshold together, for the first time in weeks. The difference was, this time, they came to her. Helen rose slowly from the armchair, her feet bare against the cold wooden floors, a quiet strength in her every movement. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. It was their turn now, and this conversation would be on her terms. When she opened the door, Dana was the first to speak, her voice sharp but trembling. "Mom, we need to talk." Jason stood slightly behind her, his posture slumped, his hands shoved into his pockets. He was always the quiet one, the one who couldn't bear confrontation. Today, he looked more withdrawn than usual, as though he too sensed the gravity of what was happening. Helen didn't say anything, just stepped back to allow them inside. She wasn't going to offer them pleasantries or a place to sit. She wasn't going to make this easy. "Come in," she said calmly, closing the door behind them. Dana moved first, striding past Helen into the living room, while Jason followed silently, his eyes cast downward. Helen walked in after them, watching as they stood awkwardly by the sofa, as if unsure of their next move. Without a word, Helen gestured to the chairs. She wanted them to sit, to feel the weight of what was about to happen. They needed to hear this from her. She wasn't going to let them twist the truth anymore. When they were seated, Helen remained standing, her posture erect, her gaze steady. She knew that Dana was waiting for her to speak, to offer some kind of forgiveness or, at the very least, an explanation. But Helen had none to offer. She wasn't interested in excuses, in explanations. She was done with that. "Dana, Jason," she began, her voice even but firm. "I'm sure you have a lot to say, but I want to make one thing clear before we go any further. I know everything." Dana's face froze, her mouth hanging open as though she hadn't expected this. Jason shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes darting to the floor. Helen reached down to the table and picked up a folder. She placed it in front of them with deliberate care, opening it to reveal a set of neatly organized papers, copies of fraudulent credit applications, Dana's name, Helen's information, the signatures, the dates. Everything was laid bare, irrefutable. "This," Helen said quietly, her finger tracing the page, "is your attempt to open another account in my name, using my details. Again." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Dana's eyes flicked from the papers to her mother's face, her cheeks flushed with something between anger and fear. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unwilling to meet Helen's eyes. Mom, Dana sputtered, her voice shaking as she tried to form a defense. I didn't mean to. It was just. It was just to help out. You don't understand. I thought. Helen raised a hand, cutting her off. She didn't need to hear it. Not anymore. She had heard the excuses, the justifications, the lies too many times before. No, Helen said firmly, her voice a quiet power. You crossed a line, Dana, and I'm done letting you manipulate me. Dana's face twisted with frustration. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain, to shift the blame. I was just trying to get by. I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't. Helen looked at her daughter, her eyes cold, yet full of something else. Disappointment. Dana's words grew more desperate, more tangled, but Helen remained unmoved. This was not the time for emotion, not anymore. This was about truth. I don't want to hear your excuses, Helen said, her voice cutting through the air with a calm finality. You've drained me for too long. You've used me for far too long. And now, you'll answer for it. Dana's face collapsed in on itself. Her composure faltered as the last of her defenses crumbled. She looked at Jason, who finally raised his eyes, only to lower them again, unable to meet Helen's gaze. Mom, please. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I could fix it, And then it happened. The shift. The real weapon that Dana always turned to when she saw control slipping away. The tears. Dana's eyes welled up, her voice breaking as she crumbled in her seat. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you hate me. I needed the money. I thought I could pay it back. I didn't know what else to do. Her sobs filled the room, raw and undignified, and for a moment, it felt as though everything Helen had done, every step she'd taken, had been for nothing. For a split second, she almost felt the pull of the old habit, the habit of forgiveness, of allowing Dana's tears to wash away the wrongs. But Helen didn't move. She didn't react. She didn't give in. I'm not going to let you manipulate me anymore, Helen said quietly, her voice steady, unwavering. She met Dana's eyes, and for the first time she saw the truth there. Dana wasn't just crying because she was sorry. She was crying because she had lost her grip on Helen. And that was a loss Dana couldn't handle. Jason, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Helen, I should have stopped her. I should have done something. Helen turned to him then, her gaze sharp, but not unkind. You didn't. And you won't. It's too late for apologies. Dana's sobs subsided, but she was still trembling. The moment had shifted from manipulation to despair, but it wasn't enough to sway Helen. I know what you did, Helen said quietly. Her voice softened, but her resolve didn't waver. And now, you have to face the consequences. You'll have no access to my life anymore, Dana. Not my money, not my support. Not anything. A long silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick. Dana wiped her face, trying to regain some semblance of composure, but it was too late. Helen had made her decision, and Dana could no longer control her. Helen stood, her posture resolute, and turned toward the door. Please leave, she said softly, her voice steady and final. For a long moment, Dana and Jason didn't move, but finally, Dana stood, Jason following her silently. Without another word, they left the house. The door closed behind them, and for the first time in years, the silence in the room felt like peace. Helen stood there, unmoving, as the weight of everything she had done settled around her. It was done, and she was finally free. The knock on the door was hesitant, almost as if Dana herself wasn't quite sure she should be here. It had only been a few days since their last confrontation, but Helen knew that this moment was coming. Dana had always been like this, reckless, but also strangely desperate when she couldn't control the narrative. This time, she wouldn't get away with it. This time, it was over. Helen stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the street outside as she heard the muffled sounds of Dana and Jason approaching the door. When she opened it, they stood there, the tension thick in the air. Dana was holding a thick envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to Helen without speaking. "Here," Dana said, her voice tight and flat. "I need to know why you did it." Helen took the envelope without a word, her gaze steady. She could feel Dana's eyes on her, demanding, waiting for an explanation that Helen wasn't about to give. "Come in," Helen said, her voice as calm as ever. Dana hesitated, glancing at Jason who stood behind her. He shifted uncomfortably, but followed Dana into the house without protest. Helen closed the door quietly, and they both moved into the living room, where the same sense of finality hung in the air as before, the same silence, the same calm. Helen sat in the chair across from Dana and Jason, who took their seats, their eyes locked on her. Dana opened the envelope and pulled out the will. The paper was heavy in her hands, and Helen could see her fingers trembling as she scanned the text. Dana's face paled as she read through the terms. The shock was immediate and unmistakable. Her eyes flicked to Helen, then back to the paper, her expression slowly shifting from confusion to something darker. Hurt, anger, and a dawning realization. "What the hell is this?" Dana's voice cracked. "Why was I removed from the will?" Helen met her daughter's gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because you removed my trust," she answered softly, as if the words were the simplest truth. Dana's jaw tightened, her hands clenched the will tighter, as though it might disintegrate in her grip. I didn't do anything. Why would you? How could you do this to me?" Jason, who had been eerily silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was small, apologetic. "Helen, please, we never meant for it to get this far." He paused, then added, "We thought, we thought we'd always be able to rely on you. That you'd always be there. For us." Helen's gaze remained firm, but there was no malice in her tone when she spoke. "That's the problem, Jason. You always thought I'd be there. And I always was. Even when you didn't deserve it. But no more. I can't continue being used, drained. Not anymore." Dana opened her mouth, her expression wild with disbelief. "But you can't just take everything from me. You can't. You—" Helen raised her hand again, cutting her off. "I'm not taking anything from you, Dana. You forfeited your place here long ago. Every time you took what wasn't yours, every time you crossed a boundary, you were taking from me. Now I'm taking back what's mine. My life. My peace." Dana's eyes watered, her voice rising with desperation. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. I thought I could fix it. I was just trying to make things better. I swear I was." The tears were back, streaming down her face, and in that moment, it was clear to Helen that Dana was no longer pretending to be the powerful, manipulative force she had once been. Now, all that was left was a shattered version of her daughter, someone who had pushed too far and couldn't handle the consequences. "I know you thought you could fix it," Helen said quietly. "But this time, you've gone too far. There's nothing to fix anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of Helen's words settling heavily on them. Jason seemed to shrink back, looking at his wife helplessly. His face lined with regret. It was too late for apologies, too late for excuses. Helen had made her decision, and now the consequences were clear. Dana wiped her tears angrily, looking up at Helen, the words barely a whisper. "You think I'm the only one who's hurt you, don't you?" Helen's chest tightened. For a fleeting moment she saw the girl who once needed her, who once clung to her for support, but it was gone in an instant. She no longer felt that pull, that soft compassion she had always extended to Dana. It had withered, replaced by a cool, unyielding strength. "I think," Helen began, her voice still calm but full of finality, "that you've spent your whole life taking from me, from everyone around you, and I'm done. You've crossed the line, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't seen it." Dana looked like she wanted to say more, to fight back, but the words were lost, swallowed by the sheer weight of what Helen had just said. It wasn't anger in Dana's eyes anymore. It was guilt. It was regret. And, somewhere beneath it all, there was a flicker of understanding. But it came too late. Helen stood then, her posture unwavering, signaling that the conversation was over. She didn't need to say more. She had already said everything that mattered. "Please leave," she said quietly, her voice as gentle as it was firm. For a moment, neither Dana nor Jason moved. The air was thick with the gravity of what had been said, but finally Dana stood, and Jason followed without a word. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. As the door clicked shut behind them, Helen felt a strange stillness wash over her. It was over. The years of manipulation, the quiet sacrifices, the endless guilt, it was all behind her now. Just as she started to turn away, a soft voice came from the hallway. "Grandma?" Emily called softly, standing in the doorway, her eyes bright with quiet understanding. Helen turned to face her granddaughter, her heart swelling with something indescribable. Emily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Helen, hugging her tightly. "I'm proud of you, Grandma. I know you had to be strong." Helen closed her eyes, holding Emily close, letting her warmth fill the spaces left by the years of quiet, unspoken pain. The storm was over, and the calm was all that remained. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart," Helen whispered softly, "and I'm so glad you're here." The world outside was still, the sun beginning to dip beneath the horizon. And Helen knew, this time, it was finally, truly, over. Helen sat in her small, cluttered office, the heavy pen in her hand a constant reminder of the finality of what she was about to do. The air in the room felt charged, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, yet there was a strange sense of calm accompanying it. Emily was no longer just her granddaughter. She had become the last thread in a tapestry Helen was weaving for the future. Her future, and the future she had promised Emily long ago when she had decided to take charge of her own destiny. The documents were already in front of her, finalized by the estate attorney. The will had been updated, the changes made. Helen had read them over and over, but this time the words didn't feel heavy. This time, they felt like the natural next step, like the end of one chapter and the peaceful start of another. Her signature had already been applied to countless pages of paperwork, but this final page, the one that added funds for Emily's future apartment and art school, felt more personal. This wasn't just about legalities. This was about a promise she had made long ago. With a fluid motion, Helen signed the final line of the will. As she did, she felt a lightness in her chest, as if a weight she didn't know was there had lifted. Emily would be safe, her future secured, away from the chaos Dana had left in her wake. And Helen could rest knowing she had done the right thing. Her fingers lingered on the paper for a moment, feeling the smoothness of the ink. There were no more threats, no more manipulation, no more pulling her strings. Helen's gaze drifted out the window toward the quiet street, where the leaves of the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The world outside was peaceful, almost as if the universe had exhaled with her. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Margaret standing in the doorway, her face soft with sympathy, but also determination. It had been a quiet, unspoken agreement between them that Margaret would always be there for Helen, especially now. I've got your final copy, Helen, Margaret said quietly, holding up a folder with a crisp, official seal. Helen nodded, taking the folder from her eyes flicking over the papers inside. This was it. The last step in a long, difficult journey. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was hers now. Emily's future, secured in ink. Do you feel okay about this? Margaret asked, watching her closely. I know it's hard. Helen placed the folder on the desk and stood up, her back straight. I do, she said simply. It's done. Margaret gave a knowing look. It was the right choice. You protected her? Helen met her friend's eyes and nodded. I protected her. And myself. Margaret smiled softly, a quiet approval in her expression. You've earned it, Helen. The phone on the desk buzzed suddenly, and Helen glanced at the screen. It was a text from Jason. Her heart sank slightly, knowing this moment had arrived. The apology she had known would come, but not in the form she had expected. Helen took a deep breath before unlocking the phone and reading his message. I should have stopped her, it read. I'm sorry. I see now what you were trying to protect, and I was blind to it. I never thought you'd go this far. But I understand. I know I didn't do enough. I'm sorry for everything. Helen set the phone down slowly, her emotions a mix of something she hadn't anticipated. Regret? Maybe? Guilt? But she didn't feel pity. Not anymore. She felt nothing really. She had already made peace with everything that had happened. It's too little, too late, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Margaret, who had been quietly watching, spoke gently. He knows, Helen, but you can't change what's already been done. I don't want to, Helen replied, her voice firm. There's nothing to fix. Nothing more to do. Just then, Emily appeared in the doorway, her small figure framed by the soft light coming in from the hall. She stepped in slowly, her eyes watching her grandmother closely. Grandma? Emily said softly, a slight tremor in her voice. Helen smiled warmly, her heart swelling with pride at the girl standing before her. This was the reason, the only reason, she had fought so hard. Emily was her future. Emily was the light in the darkness. Helen walked over to her granddaughter and knelt down to meet her eyes. Yes, sweetheart? Emily wrapped her arms around Helen, her small face buried in her grandmother's shoulder. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. Thank you for choosing peace. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, holding Emily tightly against her. I had to, darling. You deserve peace. We both do. Emily pulled back just slightly, her eyes bright and full of sincerity. I know, Grandma. I promise I'll take care of it all. I'll make sure we're okay. Helen held her gaze, feeling the weight of her granddaughter's words settle deeply in her heart. I know you will. You're stronger than I ever was. And in that moment, Helen knew that she had done the right thing. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This wasn't about anger. It was about a future, a legacy that would be different from the one she had feared. It was about the peace she had fought for, the calm she had earned. Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Helen sat down to write a letter. It was short, but it held everything she needed to say, everything she had kept silent for years. She wrote the letter slowly, carefully, her pen moving with deliberate intention. She wasn't angry anymore. She was past that. But she still had words left to say, words Dana needed to hear, even if she never would. Dear Emily, she wrote, her handwriting neat and steady. This decision wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about trust. It was about peace. And now, it's yours. It's always been yours. I'm proud of you, and I'm so glad I made this choice. I hope you understand why. I hope you can make a life that's everything I couldn't. Helen placed the letter on Emily's desk beside the new shoes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. As the night settled in around her, Helen closed her eyes, knowing the storm had passed, and the future, her future, was finally her own. The air was crisp that morning, a reminder that winter had arrived with its usual quiet force. The streets outside were dusted with snow, the kind of soft flurry that gently covered everything in a blanket of white, making the world seem smaller and more intimate. But inside, there was a new sense of space. Space Helen had carved out for herself, and she was beginning to feel it in ways that were both subtle and profound. She stood in front of the mirror, studying the reflection of herself in the new winter boots she had just purchased. They weren't anything extravagant, just sturdy, practical boots that would keep her warm during long walks through the snow. But they were hers. She had bought them with her own money, for herself, without feeling guilty or like she owed anyone anything. Helen ran her fingers over the soft leather, the slight scent of new shoes a comfort. It had been years since she had bought something purely for herself. Years spent trying to meet others' expectations, trying to make sure everyone around her was taken care of. Today, the boots felt like a symbol, a quiet act of reclamation. She had finally stepped into a life that was truly her own, and it felt better than she could have imagined. With a small smile, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. The world outside was still, but it felt different. There was peace now, a peace that had eluded her for so long. She made her way to the local community center, where she had started volunteering to teach senior citizens about financial literacy. It was a small group, but it was important to her. The classes were about more than just money. They were about taking back control, about making sure that the years of hard work and sacrifices didn't go unnoticed, that the wisdom of experience was passed down. Walking into the room, Helen felt a new kind of pride. The seniors looked up as she entered, some with eager smiles, others with quiet curiosity. There was no pretension here, no complicated family drama, just people wanting to make sense of their lives. And Helen, with her newfound clarity, was more than ready to help. The class went smoothly, and by the end, Helen felt a quiet satisfaction. She wasn't just teaching them about money, she was teaching them about self-worth, about reclaiming power over their own futures, just as she had done for herself. As the group dispersed, one of the women lingered behind, her weathered face soft with gratitude. "You know," the woman said gently, "you remind me of someone I used to know. A long time ago. She wasn't afraid to live her own life. She wasn't afraid to take care of herself. I think she'd be proud of you." Helen smiled at the woman, her heart full. "Thank you," she replied simply, her voice steady, though there was a lump in her throat. "I think I'm proud of me, too." Later that afternoon, Emily arrived at Helen's house, a sketch pad clutched tightly to her chest. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she rushed in, the new pair of boots on her feet clicking softly against the floor. "Grandma, look!" Emily said, almost breathless with anticipation as she handed the sketch pad over. Helen took the pages in her hands and opened them, her eyes scanning the intricate drawings. They were beautiful. Delicate lines, soft shading. But it was more than just technique. The drawings spoke to Helen. They were reflections of her journey, of the strength she had found, and of the peace she had worked so hard to achieve. This is amazing, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "You captured everything." Emily smiled shyly, her face glowing with pride. "I wanted to show you, Grandma. I wanted to show you how much I understand now, how much you've taught me." Helen reached out, pulling Emily into a warm hug, feeling the weight of all the years, both the painful and the precious, soften between them. She hadn't realized until this moment just how much Emily had grown, how much she had absorbed, how much she would carry forward. "Thank you," Helen whispered into her hair. "You're going to do wonderful things, Emily. Wonderful things." Later, when they sat down with a cup of coffee at Helen's favorite cafe, Margaret joined them. The little cafe was one of the few places Helen allowed herself to enjoy. It wasn't far from her house, a small, warm place where the baristas knew her by name and where the chatter of other patrons was a comforting background to the soft jazz that played overhead. They sat together, 3 generations of women, each one stronger in her own way. Emily, with her bright future ahead, filled with dreams. Margaret, with her unwavering support, always there when Helen needed her. And Helen, finally, truly free from the weight of years spent giving too much of herself to those who never understood. "I'm proud of you, you know," Margaret said, her voice soft over the rim of her coffee cup. "You've come a long way." Helen smiled, her eyes meeting Margaret's with a look of quiet understanding. "I have," she said, "and I'm finally ready to live it, all of it." The conversation flowed easily, and the hours passed without them even noticing. Helen didn't feel rushed anymore. There was no urgency, no guilt. Just moments, one after another, of peace. She had made her choices, and they had led her here, into a life of her own making, a life that was full of promise and possibility. When they finally stood to leave, Helen glanced around the cafe, taking it all in. It was the same as it had always been, yet it felt entirely new. This was her life now. She had finally stepped into it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. As they walked out into the cold air, the world around them was calm, still, and full of promise. Helen smiled softly as she took Emily's hand, feeling the warmth between them. She didn't need anything more. Her future was already here, and it was exactly what she had hoped for. The sun filtered softly through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. Helen sat in her cozy chair, her fingers lightly resting on the phone as she stared at the screen. She had seen it earlier, but something made her hesitate. Something made her wait. It was a message from Dana. Helen wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe nothing at all. But there it was. A message. A final attempt to reach out. The words were simple. An apology. Something she hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please know that I never meant to cause you so much pain. I'm sorry." For a long moment, Helen didn't move. The weight of it pressed on her, but not in the way it once had. It was different now. The anger, the confusion, the years of resentment, those had faded with time and choices. She opened the message, letting her eyes trace the words once, twice. And then she set the phone down, without replying. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't need to respond. The apology, the one she'd never gotten before, felt like an echo, soft and fleeting. Dana's words no longer had the power to sway her. They didn't bring the anger bubbling to the surface. Instead, they felt like a whisper from the past, a chapter she had long since closed. Helen placed the phone back on the table and stood. She moved over to the window, watching the world outside, a quiet park where children played, couples walked hand in hand. The life she had worked so hard to build for herself was right there, in front of her. She could feel it in the air, in the steady pulse of the world outside, in the warmth of her home. "Grandma?" Emily's voice broke the silence, soft but with purpose. Helen turned to see her granddaughter standing in the doorway, her face glowing with a quiet excitement. "Would you like to go for a walk?" Emily asked. "The weather's perfect today." Helen smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of Emily's open, trusting eyes. The girl was growing up, blossoming into something beautiful and strong, and Helen knew she had done her part. She had protected what mattered. "I'd love that," Helen said, moving toward the coat rack. She slipped on her new winter boots. Strong, sturdy, exactly what she needed, and felt an unfamiliar yet welcoming warmth in the soles, the way the leather fit just right. "Let's go," she added, her voice light, filled with the promise of a simple moment shared. Together they walked out into the park, the cold air crisp against their faces, but the sun above them warm and steady. Helen's feet sank into the snow with every step, the crunch of her boots marking her place in the world, each movement bringing her closer to a peace she had earned. She glanced at Emily, who was beside her, her hand brushing against her grandmother's, their shared bond like an unspoken promise. As they strolled, the world seemed to open up before them. Helen felt lighter with each step, the weight of the past growing dimmer, replaced by the lightness of the present. The years of sacrificing, of guilt, of second-guessing, all of it was fading. She had made her choice, and now she was living it. When they returned home, Helen sat at her desk, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace as she took out her journal. The day had been small in its movements, but huge in its significance. She opened the journal to the first page and wrote, slowly, carefully, "I protected what mattered." It was simple, but it was enough. The words on the page were a testament to everything she had fought for, everything she had overcome. Dana's apologies, her manipulations, were nothing now. Helen had walked into the bank, closed her daughter's access, and in doing so, she had finally stepped into her own life. And for the first time in years, it felt right. She closed the journal with a quiet sigh of relief and stood up, moving toward the window to look out at the fading light. The day was ending, but this was only the beginning. For the first time, Helen Carter was living the life she had always wanted. Unencumbered, free, and finally at peace. She smiled softly to herself, knowing the road ahead was hers to walk, and there was no one left to stop her. She mocked my shoes, Helen thought, her lips curving into a smile as she adjusted her boots for the final time. So I walked into the bank, closed her access, and finally stepped into my own life. The weight of the past had slipped away. It was over. And for the first time, Helen felt ready to embrace all that was yet to come.